Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Pod and the Pendulum, your weekly horror movie podcast that covers all horror movie franchises, one movie and one episode at a time. I'm your host, Mike Snoonian, and I am not joined this week by Jerry Smith. Jerry, unfortunately, had a bit of a family emergency he had to take care of, so he asked if we could still record tonight because we actually have 3 guests lined up. We figured 2 is super easy and always goes so well, so let's go for 3 now. We're going to eventually have a 30-person podcast on and try to break some records right now. So let's go around the table right now, and we'll start with our returning guest. You first heard him on our Scream 2 episode. He was our first ever guest. He's the editor-in-chief of Ghastly Grinning and the co-host of Keep Screaming, the Keep Screaming podcast. We have Ryan Larson.
Hey, thanks for having me back on. I'm super excited to talk about this movie with you guys.
So glad to have you back on. You were wonderful to have when we talked Scream 2, and a ray of positivity, so we're definitely excited to have you on as well.
I try.
And you succeed, my friend, and you succeed. So, up next, we have the co-host of the Horror Virgin podcast, a weekly show that is, and could be called like bullying in some cases. They make one of their dear friends who hates horror movies and despises being scared. They make him watch a different scary movie every week.
Every movie is consensual, though. He agrees.
Okay. So we have Jen from the Horror Virgin podcast. Jen, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. I had one question.
Excited. Thanks.
Is the goal of your show to make Todd crap his pants? Like
that might be Mikey's goal. My goal really is to convince him to love horror, because I want to convince everyone to love horror, and I think I'm going to win him over one of these days. But I think Mikey does try to make him squirm as much as possible.
And you're about 68 episodes in? Am I right on the count there?
Yeah, I think 68 or 67. Yeah, so he's got a lot under his belt. He still screams and throws his phone in the air sometimes. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
because every show is like, I hated this movie. So
right.
You've got your work cut out.
He hates it. When he hates a movie, that means that it scared the shit out of him.
Okay.
That's a compliment to the movie.
And last but not least, we have Arielle Fisher, freelance writer, editor, and podcast. She's actually just been named the editor of The Bite from Shudder, the streaming horror movie service, which you can go to Shudder right now and subscribe to this weekly newsletter. It comes out every Tuesday. You can also find her work in the pages of Fangoria magazine, Rue Morgue magazine, and I believe you've just come on board with Slash Film.
I have a column with Slash Film called Queering the Scene.
Excellent. How are you doing tonight, Arielle?
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. How we usually like to start the show is we usually ask our guests what it was about not if we're covering Scream, we wouldn't say Friday the 13th, of course, but what it is about Friday the 13th and this particular entry that wanted to make you come on board and talk about it. So tonight we're talking about 2009 remake. So what was it about this movie in particular that kind of grabbed your attention that made you want to come on tonight? And we'll start, I guess, in the same order. We'll go with Ryan first.
So I'm a huge fan of slashers. The podcast I do with my best friend B is actually dissecting slasher movies one by one. It's my favorite genre, always has been. Fell in love with horror because of Scream. And because of me jumping in so late in the game, I kind of had to play some catch up. So I was definitely kind of a younger kid, mid-teens when I started watching all the slasher movies. And I, of course, loved all the franchises, but Friday was always near the bottom. That has changed a lot in recent years, but to begin with, it kind of was. So when 2009, when it came out, I just instantly fell in love with it because, one, I'm a sucker for that CW cast. Give me all the Padalecki and Panabaker that is available. And two, I really liked how they condensed basically 4 movies into one, especially because it's to this day, I'm still not like the biggest fan of Friday the 13th Part 1, like the very first one. So I loved like the jump through that in the intro credit and then really jump into the movie. So yeah, I mean, I always champion this movie when they talk about remakes. I know a lot of that era kind of gets, kind of gets crapped on. I think the internet's coming around, but this was always the one. Whenever that question inevitably comes up, like, what's your favorite remake? It's this and the Fright Night remake.
Yes, I love that one.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So Jen, why don't you go next? What is, you said I love this one. So what is it about this one that you love?
Well, I love Friday the 13th is my favorite of this. Well, I love Scream, but Friday the 13th is my favorite of the slasher franchises. I love Jason. I think it's something about wanting to like commemorate days that I was always so excited when it was Friday the 13th because I would get to watch a scary movie and I could kind of excuse it. And the first or the original is one of my all-time favorite horror movies. It's like comfort food. When you look at the slasher formula, it's like it's almost pure, and it doesn't really scare me anymore, but I would watch it so much over and over again. And when I saw that we were going to have a remake, I was so excited. I went to see it on opening night because it came out on Friday the 13th, I'm pretty sure. And I thought this was a pretty good remake. There are things, well, we can get into that later. But yeah, I was really excited to talk about it because I just love Jason.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you on the consistency of like Friday overall as a series. I don't think it hits the peak of, say, a Scream or an Elm Street or John Carpenter's Halloween, but it's like going to the In-N-Out Burger. Like, you're going to get pretty good quality overall, with the exception of perhaps Jason Takes Manhattan.
Yeah.
So
hey now, Jason Takes Manhattan has its charm. Okay.
Oh. I mean, so does that 3-legged Chihuahua that my wife and I almost adopted, but actually,
you know what? That's an apt comparison for Jason Takes Manhattan. Let's be honest.
Yes, or Jason on a boat.
Exactly. Jason Takes a Cruise.
I cannot, for the life of me, whenever I think of that movie, the song On a Rope from Rocket from the Crypt gets stuck in my head for hours, except I keep singing Jason on a boat over and over again, and it's really annoying. Ariel, I've heard you might have a contrarian opinion on the remake overall compared to the rest of us, so I'm interested to hear your take. What was it that made you want to talk about this movie?
Interesting, actually, because that I agree with everybody. I dig the hell out of this one.
I'm completely wrong. Excellent.
But I come to it from a completely different vantage point. I don't even think I saw any of the Friday the 13th in their entirety until I was maybe in my mid-20s. Mm-hmm. I had seen some, snippets of Halloween. The slashers were never that big for me. And I also kind of worked a little backwards. There were some horror movies that I started out with as a kid, but for the most part, I came to them, like the old school movies, a little bit later. I started kind of keeping up with the trends as they were happening. But with this, I didn't actually see this movie until a few months ago for the first time.
Whoa.
So it was recommended I had kind of put it off because it looked kind of trashy. I didn't have any good vibes about it. I was like, it doesn't need to happen. I don't get why this is a thing. And I'd been so disappointed with other, slasher and horror remakes, like the Nightmare on Elm Street remake was such a disappointment. So I just, I was reticent. And then my partner, Jonathan Barkan, he's at Dread Central, he was like, no, you have to watch it. It's amazing. So he kind of forced me to sit down and watch it just a few months ago, and I was completely blown away because, it's like we've already mentioned, it blows through the first couple of movies lightning fast, and then it kind of stops being a remake and almost becomes a sequel.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating, and especially the way they approach it, but they've still got these nice callbacks like the sleeping bag and there's all this really fun stuff in it. So, and Derek Mears is ridiculous, but I digress. Get into that in a minute, I'm sure. But yeah, no, I love the hell out of this one, and I'm super stoked to, dig into it.
So I'm interested, what was it about the Friday series that made you avoid it? until your mid-20s?
Well, I don't think it was anything about the franchise itself. Like it wasn't like I'd heard they were terrible or anything. But I can tell you exactly what got me into them. And oddly enough, it was Jason Takes a Boat Ride. It was on a podcast, Toronto-based podcast called See You Next Wednesday, and it was Time Bandits. Sorry, same guys, different show. And they were taking a look at Jason Takes Manhattan. So they were like, why don't you come on? You dig this stuff. And I'd never seen it before, and I hadn't gone through the entire franchise. So I actually started with Jason Takes Manhattan. Oh, wow. And I loved the hell out of it because it's so terrible in all the best ways. And you can just dig into it. And it's shot in Vancouver, but it's supposed to be Manhattan. And they have that one damn shot. And it's like, cool, there goes our budget. So there's a lot to love and a lot to hate, and kind of at the same time. So that was kind of my gateway for it. But otherwise, I love the slashers.
Interesting. Okay, so overall, you're a slasher fan, but you had avoided the Friday films up until that point, mostly.
Yeah, and not even for any particular reason, just kind of by happenstance.
Yeah. It's like you'll get to it eventually at some point.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay.
Just miss movies, you know?
Hmm?
Sorry. Sometimes you just miss movies, you know, and I try to keep up with the new stuff. And I got really into the 90s slashers and just kind of like the teen slashers, and just kind of missed some of the sequels. And I was a little too young to watch the early ones when they came out. So, you know, just weren't on my radar.
Exactly. Yeah. It's kind of the same.
Yeah. And it's hard to put the seventh one in a franchise on your radar unless there's a reason for you to watch it. Like I had a boyfriend who loved Jason Goes to Hell and showed it to me. And that was one of the first ones that I'd seen other than the original.
It's interesting. It's so interesting to me because I just think that if I watched Jason Takes Manhattan first, I would have avoided it. I would have been like, all right, I think I'm done. So I just find that really fast because it's the one movie in the series where I'm like, and Jerry and I think we might try at some point to brawl over his hatred of Jason Goes to Hell, where I love that movie and how it tries to do some weird and fun and interesting things. And he thinks it's the worst movie he's like ever seen. So it's really interesting to me. So, all right. So diving into the remake here a little bit, let's take a quick look at where horror was at this point in time. I mean, basically the mid to late 90s were the age of remakes. 2003, Freddy vs. Jason hits theaters. It does $1 bazillion. Everyone's pretty happy with it, and there's a lot of talk of like, can we get Pinhead involved? What about Freddy versus Jason versus Ash? There was talk of that at the time. Meanwhile, Michael Bay and his Platinum Dunes company come out with a remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Movie is helmed by music video director Marcus Nispel. Interesting enough, it is still the director of photography is Daniel Pearl, who shot the first Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So it's kind of interesting to see the markedly different looks between the original and the remake, even though they're lensed by the same person. This movie's massive. It goes on to make about $107 million across the globe on less than $10 million for a budget. And that opens up the floodgates. So I guess my question for all of you guys is, and Ryan, it sounds like this era was kind of like a tipping point for you, like where you jumped on board with slasher movies and kind of experienced them for the first time. So what is everyone's impression of like all these remakes in a general sense that came out, say, between 2004 to 2010 when it kind of slows down a bit?
See, for me, it's when I got my driver's license. So it makes sense that these are the movies that I started to go see all the time because I had the opportunity finally to take myself to the movies instead of going, Mom, please take me to go see this movie. The first movie I ever snuck into actually was Freddy vs. Jason. I think we bought tickets for like head over heels and went to Freddy vs. Jason instead. Some romantic comedy. And so that was actually the first like movie I ever snuck into. I am a huge fan of this era of remakes. I will always, I come to the defense of it all the time. I even like a lot of the trash, like the Sorority Row remake and the Black Xmas, which I think have their own merits and are a lot of fun, even though they are kind of nasty. It was an interesting time because we were also pretty deep into the torture porn, and so they were trying to find this balance of like, okay, we don't have the meta commentary of Scream anymore, but these slashers are something that are doing well, so how do we balance that with like what's popular with the genre right now, but mixing with the slasher genre. So that's like kind of how I came into it, was just having my driver's license, and I'd already blown through everything I could find in the video store that from my era of like kind of 90s, early 2000s stuff. And then kind of like you guys mentioned before, it was like, now it's about keeping up with the trend.
Yeah, I keep meaning to actually. Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
Go ahead. You're good.
I kept meaning to keep meaning to come back to some of the remakes from this period, because I remember Black Xmas and I remember not liking it, and I'm a huge fan of the original. So, but I think it's time for a reappraisal, and even things like it's interesting that you bring up the Sorority Row thing, because we may or may not be working on something like that with The Bite, but I keep meaning to sit down and reappraise these because I hated them at the time. And I remember not feeling too good even about the Texas Chainsaw remake, because again, I think there was just kind of this snobbish purist thing in the back of my head that was like, nah, we don't need to do this. Like, don't touch the originals, meh, or something. I don't know. But I loved Freddy vs. Jason. Like, I was listening to your guys' episodes on it, and I kind of had to sit there and like, interesting, because there wasn't a lot of love for the movie.
Really? Okay. I thought we gave it a pretty decent amount of love.
Someone was saying, I can't remember, I think it was the first episode you did on it, and someone, I think the guest, I can't remember, was bringing up that it just felt like it was dislocated from its place in the franchises. Like, it felt alienated. And I kind of get that, but at the same time, I'm kind of like, it makes me not care. Like, it's so goofy that it's kind of just like, all right, I'll suspend disbelief and just go for this ride. Why not?
I think it's a fun ride.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely a fun movie. I think they overthought it a little bit. It shouldn't have taken 10 years to make that movie. And I think that given the fact that it took a decade, like what we got, there was some. I think the biggest problem is you had a director that didn't necessarily have any sort of kind of affinity for any of the characters in it. So you get like a Jason that just feels like not Jason in that movie.
And that's totally fair. And I completely agree with you. It does feel, it feels, perhaps it does feel disconnected from its source material, but there is something super enjoyable about it. And it's things like that. And just the way you, Ryan, were talking about these other remakes that kind of makes me want to sit down and give them another go. Particularly when the Black Christmas announcement came out, I was like, I really need to sit down with that remake and kind of just have a few drinks or something.
Right. How about you, Jen?
Sorry, I like a lot of these remakes and the age of all the remakes, and I think when I think about actually watching the movie and how scared I am when I watch them, I think a lot of the remakes that were coming out at this time, just with the advancements in film and technology, I think they scare me a little bit more. There are not, people are going to get mad at me about this, but there are not a lot of older horror movies that actually scare me, and I can appreciate them, and I love a lot of older ones, like the original Fright Night is one of my favorites too, but they don't actually really scare me. And I think part of that too is I'm usually watching them at home on my TV. I'm not watching them on a big screen. Like when we did our Halloween episode, I'd been watching it for years, just like while I was folding laundry or something. And then when I really sat down and watched it in my friend's gigantic home theater, like I was a lot more scared. And so I think we're going to see these remakes in the theaters, and I think they're just a little bit scarier, or maybe it's just the experience of it.
No, I completely agree, and I totally see what you mean. And I think with things like this, like particularly with this remake specifically, they kind of ramped everything up to 11. Like they took what was the trope of the time from the originals and they just jacked it all up. Like Derek Mears in this is a beast, and he just books it. Like Jason never felt threatening to me. He was always just this big lumbering shark kind of thing, right? Turns with the head and then the body follows. But Mears in this is just ruthless. He is genuinely threatening, and he's terrifying. And I can imagine how seeing something like this, even before seeing the original, would definitely make a newer generation of horror fans look back at the originals and go, man, what's the big deal?
Yeah, Mears goes back to that kind of Steve Dash Ted White Jason, where it's a lot more athleticism to him overall, except he's even more so. Like you said, he's cranked up to 11 at that point in terms of the way he moves. Like, I'm thinking of that move he makes right before the title card comes up, and it's just super athletic. I remember seeing like a press screening, an advanced screening of this movie, and the audience going apeshit when the title card came up. Like, so for people that I think in the years that followed said, "Oh, the remake was trash, it was no good," it's like I'm calling bullshit, because that whole theater went nuts. When Mears came on board and that title card came up, I mean, that place was rocking. Ariel, you said something pretty interesting a few minutes ago about originally looking at all these remakes and kind of like turning up our noses at them. I think as a horror community, I think we did that a bit when they first came out. Now a lot of them are going on a decade or even longer at this point. What do you think the reappraisal for some of these movies have been, and which, it's a little bit off topic, but which ones do you think are most due a second look?
Like, which of the remakes do I think deserve a reappraisal?
Like that time period from like 2004 to really it ends with the Nightmare on Elm Street remake, I'd say, is when that period kind of ends.
Well, I think we are getting a bit of a reappraisal. Like, I know anytime I bring up something like 13 Ghosts, it goes over like gangbusters. Like, everybody just goes nuts for it. And I mean, it's not a remake of like a 70s, 80s slasher. It's a remake of, an older horror film, but it still has an audience and a fan base. And I think there's a specific tone of from the movies that were made around the early 2000s that, like, especially the remakes, where it just kind of became reckless abandon, and it's all just fun for the sake of it. And frankly, there's no reason not to have that. I think this movie in particular definitely needs a reappraisal, because I was going through the Rotten Tomatoes and it has an abysmal rating. And the reviews were so harsh. Like, oh, we've seen this before. Oh, this is a retread. Oh, this is exactly the same. This was boring. I was bored. The most common thing I saw was I was bored. And I'm like, what fucking screening were you in? Because like, I mean, when we think about the way that Jason used to be, Jason was boring. When we think about that in the context of the tropes, and I'm probably going to make someone angry with that. I'm sorry, but deal with it. When we think about that in the context of the films, it's like, this is so much more electric. And they're being referential. They're taking, they're not just taking an older film and smacking a new title on it. And they're not making the mistakes that they made with the Nightmare on Elm Street remake, where it's like, hey, let's try and humanize Freddy, even if he's still a villain. No, he's still, there is actually, it was interesting because Josh McMillan at Dread Central wrote a piece about the subplot of Jason running a drug op.
Yes.
Like that he's actually a pot dealer. I'll send you guys a link to that, and maybe you can share it in the show notes or something. But it's like,
please do.
It goes to these really strange and interesting places that if you look down your nose at horror, you're going to be too busy. If you've got your nose too high in the air, you're not going to see any of it. And it deserves attention because it's actually quite clever. And the way they subvert the trends is really interesting. And the characters are actually pretty likable, and with the exception of Mr. Spectacular Nipple Placement. But everybody else is like, fine. But no, I think this one especially deserves a reappraisal. I think something like A Nightmare on Elm Street could totally use another remake, because that one botched it so badly. But yeah, I'm excited to see what they do with Black Christmas. I'm so stoked with that. I think some of the other ones like Scream can just be like left alone. They got it right the first time. Let's not fuck with that.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree. And it's funny too, like as soon as you brought that up, how people bring up, or how people were kind of like, because I did the same thing, like right around this time, it's when I became interested in like journalism and film and analyzing film. So I had this, like, for some reason you have it in your head, you're like, well, I don't need this. I'm above that. I watch the originals. And I think it was a transitional phase, that era in particular, because like I even look back and think about it, like my dad's generation didn't have to deal with the remake trend like we do. Like the way that remakes are generated now is so often and so like mass produced that it's really different than like the generation before us, who were the people that were analyzing and reviewing this movie. And so for them, it was something that was like the first remake of something, really. Like for the first time, we were starting to see a lot of those remakes from the movies of their generation. And even like any remakes they had in their generation were from movies in the 30s and the 40s. So the movies just weren't like the popcorn culture that they were back then as they are now. So I think it was a very different generation of people reviewing these films, because same as you, when I look through the reviews, I'm stunned by like what I see, because as a critic, like it makes sense what I see as a critic, because I feel like if you ask the audience, they would have been like, fuck yeah, this movie rules. But like the critic is the one who maybe at the time was viewing it too analytically and is looking at it through like a different lens. So I do think a lot of these movies need that reappraisal. I like I mentioned before, just from that generation, I can think of. I think Black Xmas has a lot going for it. That cast is incredible. I would love to see a cut that doesn't have the Weinstein's filthy hands all over it, because they totally. Yeah, they perved that movie out, and it's a giant bummer. And then also Sorority Row does a lot of really fun things. You can stay away from Prom Night. Don't worry about that one, because it's not very good. But yeah, I would love to see like a reappraisal of these films, because that generation, I think, got glanced over a lot. But like, look at the money. Obviously, people wanted to see it, but the critics were just like not in love with them. But you can look at the box office to see that like people wanted these movies, and they were doing well enough that like I think that's obvious.
And I think people wanted to see, like, I grew up hearing about how scary Friday the 13th was and all of these older movies and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I wanted to see a movie that felt scary to me, too. So, like, that was modernized and was something that felt like it was, like, people my age, you know? And so that's part of why I just ate all these remakes up. And some are better than others. I particularly like the Amityville Horror remake a lot.
Oh, I love that. I love that one, yeah.
And not just for Ryan Reynolds' abs, although that is a plus.
Yeah, I was going to say, although.
Yeah, right.
See, and that's one that I remember being absolutely terrible. And I vaguely remember seeing that one in theaters. I guess I need to give it another shot.
I just remember it scared the shit out of my friend and I.
Yeah.
Whenever I think of remakes and like the reception of them, I remember a quote Stephen King had years ago, and it was a period before we got this kind of like Stephen King renaissance we're living in right now, during the late 80s, early 90s, where a lot of his properties were being turned into movies, and they were really bad movies. I mean, they were just awful. And they asked, like, does it ever bother you that what's being done to your books on screen? And he's like, no, man, the books still exist. At the end of the day, like, you can always go back and pick up my novel, and that work stands on its own. To me, with the remakes, even though if I wasn't a fan of them, a remake of Friday the 13th wasn't going to do anything to hurt the reputation of the franchise that, say, like a movie I'm not a fan of in this series, like Part 7. Like, when you're this deep, you know, a remake of Halloween isn't going to do anything to hurt John Carpenter's vision that Halloween Resurrection didn't do 10 years before it, basically. So, to me, it's just another entry in a saga, but the work that we loved, like, I used to watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre with a group of friends every weekend. On Saturday night, we would have bands play in our basement. We would throw, like, a potluck dinner, and then at 2 a.m, we would throw on Texas Chainsaw Massacre and VHS, and we would root for Franklin to get killed and high-five each other. We were little shits. You know, my feelings about the remake aside, like, nothing is ever going to change the way I feel about the original movie. Although I've come around on the remake now, where I remember seeing that, walking out of the theater and thinking, like, I could fill a giant sack with ground beef and hit it with a bat for 2 hours, and it would be the same kind of feeling. Although I've come around to think it's actually a much better film than I remembered upon walking out of the theater seeing it. Interesting. Okay.
To that note, I just have, I've been entertaining and different thought process on things over the last I guess, year or so. Because I'm of the mindset similarly that like the original will always exist and it doesn't matter and it doesn't make a difference. But when it comes to things like cinema, I mean, a lot of people, newer generations, if they're 16 when the remake comes out and they have no idea about the original has the potential to kind of get lost in time. Mm-hmm. And I think that does become a little bit of a risk. I mean, I'm not one of those people, like, don't get me wrong. All the fanboys who are like, meh, you ruined my childhood. It's like, okay, fuck off, grow up. Like, it's fine. You're okay. Mm-hmm. You know, you're fine. But, you know, there is, I guess, a little bit of a concern that people of a certain generation might just find, say, Rob Zombie's Halloween and may never know that the original Halloween existed. And frankly, I think if that's the case, that could be that could be a real shame.
Mm-hmm. Is that even possible now, though? I mean, honestly, with like how available information is for if you watch, say, like Rob Zombie's Halloween or the 2009 Friday, remake, like if you were a fan of one of those, wouldn't your immediate impulse be to Google right away, like, I wonder what else there is, and automatically, even if you had never heard of John Carpenter before, because you're like 13 years old and you just happen to like grab this movie on DVD or see it on Netflix or whatnot, wouldn't you have like all this information at your fingertips to go back and find more?
Potentially, but the risk is that most people aren't fans. Most people are passive consumers. Mm-hmm. So for the most part, you get, a kid who's been shown a scary movie at a birthday party and they never revisit it again. So then they tell their kids, oh, there's this movie that exists, and that's, you know what I mean? Like, it becomes a way of passing down knowledge that unless you are an active consumer of media, which most people aren't, those things, it becomes kind of like a dying legacy. It's almost like an oral tradition. Like, yes, that the information exists online, and really mostly this is a philosophical, metaphysical conversation. Like, it's not actually a concern, but eventually, if things stopped getting talked about and written about and researched, then they kind of cease to exist, even if they do exist in the ether somewhere. And with the turn to digital media as opposed to physical media, there becomes a legitimate concern of actually physically losing things.
Yeah, I actually agree with you a lot, just in the sense that, like, the way that generations are now, if something's not actively available, like, I went to see if Friday was streaming on anything. I own the disc, but I was like, okay, let's see if it's just streaming, because I'll pop it up, and it's not. So, and that's this remake, but like John Carpenter's Halloween is like never streaming on anything. The original one, that's not streaming anywhere. And so I think it does become a valid concern just in the generation we are in now of like, I hate to say it, but I've seen it happen because I have an 8-year-old nephew, like, where literally it's like, is it streaming on anything? Nope. Okay. That's it. That's the end of the search. Whereas like our generation grew up, it's like we were in a video store and it's like we're, alphabetically going through things. It's like, hey, I like this movie called Halloween. Oh, look, there's 5 other ones. I'll rent those. I'll watch those. But that doesn't exist anymore. And so I agree with you. Like, that's why I so much, like, 2 reasons try to do what I do. Like, 1, keep everything positive, because when you shed a negative light on people, like, it turns them off so much to it, and then there's so many other things to consume now, it just gets lost in the shuffle. And then 2, it's why I think journalism is still so important, and like, thank goodness we exist like in a genre that is so rabid. But like, anytime I see a new article and it's like, oh, like John Carpenter's Halloween, it's like, I've read 100 articles about this, but like, I don't care, because my 8-year-old nephew's probably read none. So if that's the one he clicks on, I'm stoked for it.
Yeah. And I think as times change, like, people of our generation need to know how that movie that was made when I was born, like, connect to them. So we continue to write about these movies. And I had issues with the new Halloween, but I loved that we could talk about that movie now in an updated way and talk about how the original affects the world that we're living in right now. So I think if we take the seeds of these original movies and continue to talk about how they continue to relate to us now, that keeps them present. And that makes kids want to seek them out.
Mm-hmm. I think too that horror in particular, it reflects the worries, it reflects the fears of that time period and for that generation. So when you look at a movie like when you look at a movie like the Texas Chainsaw, and we're turning this into a Texas Chainsaw Massacre podcast, which I'm totally okay with because I so love that movie and cannot wait to actually cover it one day. When you look at like people coming back from the Vietnam War completely fucked up and out of their minds, and all of a sudden all of these towns, their economies just drying up and people being spit out and left on the side of the road, essentially, what do you turn to at that point? The Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake, I remember watching that thinking like these could have been the kids from Dazed and Confused on their way to buy their Aerosmith tickets, and they just took a wrong turn at that point. Like it didn't have that same kind of impact to me overall, which is very interesting. Jen, you had, I think it said a while back about, or I think Ryan as well, like having the first few movies of Friday the 13th basically condensed down into one lean, mean machine. So what do we think of the decision to kind of tell the story of the first 4 Friday movies and within like a 20-minute time period?
If you had told me that's what they were going to do before I went into the movie to see it, I think I would have said, nope, that's going to be terrible. But they pulled it off. And I was looking at the timestamp when I watched this last night. And in the first 45 minutes of this movie, they gave us a mini slasher. They gave us the main plot points of the first 3 movies. And they set up a brand new sequel or a brand new remake of the movie. And I think it's just amazing how they managed to pull all of that off with something even as simple as the way the barn looks,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, completely agree with that. And I think it's a real testament to the writing of the script. And it's something that it genuinely irks me that the critics of the time couldn't see how much work and effort went into accomplishing that, because that is difficult to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, anytime I read reviews from people, like I can always tell when I read a review, I'm like, oh, they're a horror fan. Because if they don't recognize something like that, I'm like, got it. So you didn't watch the originals. So like you weren't there to appreciate that. And I love that they do that in this one because for this generation, like we're talking 09, like if you are an avid horror fan, I think you can definitely go back and enjoy those original movies. But if you're not, and if you're a new moviegoer, like at this point, you're really trying to hit that teen audience, like those original movies can be plotting. And like the kills are cool. Like there are cool like set pieces, but especially the first movie. And I really enjoy the first movie. I agree with what Jen said. It's a very pure slasher. Pamela Voorhees is a boring killer. Once she is revealed, that movie loses so much of its like power because she does a great monologue because she chews scenery, but that chase scene and that fight scene are god awful, and they make the last 30 minutes of that movie feel like an hour long. And so that they can give us that in the first 5 minutes of this movie and we still understand that, and then we get a couple flashbacks here and there to really hammer home the point, I think is great. Because as important as that first Friday is, like Jason is a literal pop culture phenomenon. And so to introduce him so quickly and to still give us Baghead Jason, but then still be able to give us, and not shoehorn in, but cleverly put in his mask. I think those are all really smart scripting techniques.
And also casting Nana Visitor as Pamela Voorhees just tickles me endlessly. So that was a nice touch.
I don't know who that is. I'm going
to. She's on. She is known for DS9.
Yep.
Okay. I've never been a Star Trek person, so okay. That makes
Give
sense,
yourself the luxury and the privilege of watching DS9. If you had to choose any of the series, I guarantee you that's the one that will get you in. It's fantastic.
More than New Generation.
Oh yeah.
Okay, I'll have to try a few episodes out. I really like the way that Shannon and Swift write. They had done the Freddy versus Jason remake. I think a lot of the things that are good about that movie come from the rules they set up for themselves and the way they write the characters. I think they, especially, I said before, like really Jason's just doesn't feel like Jason in that movie. I think that has more to do with the performer in that movie and not having Kane Hodder in that role. Here, I really like the rules that Shannon and Swift set up for themselves. Number one, they wanted to avoid like the meta commentary that had become very popular with Scream. I love Scream. It's one of my probably top 10 favorite horror movies, but I don't think it would really fit a Friday the 13th movie. Like they're two things, it would be like peanut butter and hummus, like two things I really like. I do not want those together. You get a Jason that's more like his part 2 self. He's just off on his own, defending his own turf. He's not actively maybe seeking anybody out to kill, but as soon as he feels threatened and cornered, he's going to eliminate all threats. I think I read a interview with Shannon and Swift where they said they described their Jason as kind of like Rambo, like someone that is a survivalist, knew how to live off the land, and could kill people very easily in very fun ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's really funny that you brought up that Joshua Millican article, because as I was watching this, I was like, I think Jason's just defending his stash here. Like, that's how he makes his money. And so, I mean, a man's got to live, because there's so much of it that works around that. But I do agree with everything you said. Like, he feels like Rambo. I love the little traps in the underground tunnels that he has. And it definitely feels more like a Friday the 13th Part 2, where we have like this much more athletic. He's also a much more athletic Jason. Like, I remember the first time he ran in this movie, that's what sold me. I was like, oh, and I love Kane Hodder. Like, I absolutely adore Kane and his performance, but it's very different. This Kane's a big guy, and so he's big, which causes menace. And Derek is also a big guy, but like, it's the athleticism that really like terrified me of that character.
Yeah, I always, to your point, Ryan, I felt like with the latter Friday the 13th movies, like Jason getting the kids always felt like a cheat. Like, it felt like you were miles away from him, and then he just popped up out of nowhere. And he completely disregarded any rules of time, space, and physics. Where here, I just never felt like, it felt like even if you had a massive running start, you weren't getting away from Derek Mears' Jason.
Mm-hmm. No.
And it felt
bucks.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, it felt like realistic too, because one of the things that could easily turn into is Jason wakes up in the morning and he does his stretches, and then he goes for his sprint, and then he gets coffee. And I feel like it was believable that he had been like surviving out in the wilderness. Like, it makes sense that he would know how to use a bow and arrow because he would need to eat. But we didn't get, like, the only time we really saw him do any of that is when he's sharpening the machete. And I feel like they gave us just enough to let us know he didn't just rise up from the bottom of a lake when a kid happened to wander through the camp. Like, he's been here ready the whole time, but we didn't have to watch it, and it didn't ever get tedious.
Yeah, and to your point, Jen, I think that they originally in their script had added like a deer carcass in his lair to kind of show how, to your point about the bow and the arrow, to show like this is how he's surviving. But I think it would have been like about $100,000 to add that in, and they're like, we don't necessarily need to do that.
Nope.
So we've talked about Jason the weed farmer for a few minutes here now. I think like Heather Donahue and Jason are out growing weed and selling it in the, that's actually a pretty good spinoff. But what do we think of like the townsfolk knowing, like, there's that one scene that stuck out that I don't necessarily love, and it's when Clay, aka the dude from Supernatural, knocks on this woman's door, and she's like, oh yeah, we know about this guy, nobody wants to bother him. That's the only scene in the movie that kind of stuck out to me as not feeling right per se. I was kind of wondering what everyone's thought about that was.
I actually really liked that part. It kind of struck me as another take on The Harbinger or Crazy Ralph, only not seeking out the kids,
Mm-hmm. No, completely. It's definitely that's definitely the function. She's totally a harbinger. The only thing that irked me about that was I was like, okay, so you're basically giving us the exact same thing you gave us in Texas Chainsaw. Cool. Awesome.
Yep.
Just like that one felt like a bit like a stamp that was just like, all right, here's this, and here's this specific actress, and this is what she does now. But But I think, especially just kind of coming back to Josh Millican's article, is that there was kind of this theory, and I really dig the idea that it's like he has this kind of deal with the town where like he brings in extra money from his weed dealings, and that helps support the like economic stability of the community. So it's kind of like they just, okay, fine, you do what you need to do. You kill those teens. That's fine.
See, I actually like that addition because I just recently rewatched Friday Part 1 and 2, and in the first one especially, like it's very well established that everyone in town either knows or suspects that someone is out in the woods killing people. I mean, it got the nickname Camp Blood for a reason, and so I think it's kind of like a nifty little throwback to that, because that was always something from those movies I wish we saw more of, was the community around Camp Crystal Lake, because we always see like the cabins and the lake, but not really the town, like the surroundings of it. But they do pop up here and there, and people are usually pretty well aware. I mean, like Crazy Ralph obviously stands out, but pretty much everyone in town in the first movie, when the cook shows up and she's like, "Hey, how do I get here?" Everyone's like, "Yeah, don't go there," because they're aware of like what's happening.
See, I love that in the first movie because no one in the town can quite put their finger in what's wrong. Like they know that two other kids, they know about Jason drowning. They know about the two camp counselors that were murdered the next year. And then there had been like incidents like the town water supply getting poisoned and all sorts of weird things going on whenever it's talked about the camp opening back up again. So it becomes like a really neat little town legend, where this scene, I think, Ariel, I think the comparison to the Texas Chainsaw remake is so perfect and so spot on, because it does give this film that kind of tone. And these are two distinct, way different properties from one another. Like a Friday the 13th movie shouldn't feel like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. And that's where it kind of just stuck out to me. It's really one of my few gripes about the remake. It's one of the ones that really stuck out to me overall.
And I mean, it's the same director, right? So that makes sense to me. Like that's one of the big reasons why I'm like, okay, so here's your stamp. Like, here's what you're doing to make it seem like it's your work. I don't know. It just jumped out at me as that specifically.
Yeah. So what do we think of the kids overall? We've talked a little bit about the town. Let's dive into the cast. I love the first group of kids overall. Yes. I want to get everyone else's opinion now. Like, what do we think of these guys?
I really like the first group of kids. I like them better than the second group of kids.
Yeah.
Same. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I can usually tell how engaging characters are. How I judge it is if I can remember their names after I've watched the movie. And I could probably tell you Whitney's name because it was on that poster, and Clay because I think they actually say it. But I think Travis might be one of them too. But other than that, I couldn't really tell you any of the characters' names in this movie other than Jason.
It's Trent, and I kept calling him Troy the whole movie, and my roommate finally went, "I don't think his name is Troy," and I was like, "Oh, whatever, I don't know." Like, I know his real name is Travis Van Winkle because his name is Travis Van Winkle,
right?
But no, I completely agree. The first group of kids is likable, which I think is on purpose, because like you're not rooting for Jason as much in that moment, because I do think the second half of the movie embraces that kind of like old, like that standard slasher where you have to have kids that aren't likable, because then those are the ones you want to see die, because you don't want to see every character you like die. Right. And like you, Ariel, were saying earlier, like ramped it up to 11. They were like, hey, these guys are super douchebags. So you're really gonna like when they die.
You also don't spend very much time with them at the beginning. Like, I wonder if we had spent the entire movie with this first group of kids, if they would have ended up being as annoying as the later group.
So I think what I like about the first group, though, is they have a chemistry with one another. And I think that's lacking a lot of times in a lot of modern horror movies starring like younger people. Like, they seem like friends. I think you enjoyed spending time with them overall. Even like really little things. Like, I think it's when, is it Mike and Amanda? I'm drawing a blank on the names right now.
It is Mike and Amanda. I have the cast list up. Yeah.
Fantastic. When they go, when it's like, hey, we're going to go have sex, like their friend is like, I'm going to leave now. He doesn't make a big production of it. He's like, oh yeah, I'm just going to go in the woods. See you guys later. He makes a little joke of it, but he's not like, well, can I watch? Can I stick her? And I think like most movies would fall into that trap like nowadays, where he's like, right, I'm off. It's a little thing. And I really like that about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I definitely felt the same way about that. Like I think that was, again, this is a testament to the writing that they made that they gave the characters at the beginning so much chemistry so that we did, they may be a touch obnoxious. They may be, like what's, again, with the character's name, Ben Feldman's character, Richie.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's a bit obnoxious, but you still kind of like him because like he's still kind of likable, even though he's a bit of a douche, but he's not douche enough to be like, fuck you. So like you care when he dies, but you're also like, you're engaged and you're engrossed. And I think that's really hard to do. So the idea that they could spend the first 20 to 25 minutes of the film establishing characters that we would not have beyond that point and making it so that we kind of miss them later on. Like, and you miss them later.
Right. Yeah. There's even a nice little moment between Mike and his girlfriend, Whitney, where, she's obviously concerned about her mom. And he's like, well, look, I've talked to her. It was her idea for me to kind of take you away for a few days so you can kind of have a break from all of this. And I thought it was like a nice little moment, like where he's not trying to get in her pants. He's not trying to pressure into sex. He's like being a pretty good boyfriend. And he's like, look not only to her, but look, obviously he knows that her mom is important to her. So he's talking to the mom as well. And I just think that's a nice little touch. It humanizes the characters in a way that, as much as I love those first 15 to 20 minutes of the movie, and I think it's a perfect short little slasher, it is a little bit sad that they're kind of all gone after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What do we think of the folks we have to follow? Yeah.
I did not. Kids.
I mean, they're body fodder. Like that's what they are. Trent is the worst, and he's meant to be the worst.
Mm-hmm.
I think Aaron Yu is thrown in there, and he's likable in everything he's in, and he's likable in this. Like Chewie's the only character that you're kind of okay with because he's the comedic relief. I think these guys, whereas like the first group is kind of subverting like the slasher tropes of the 80s, where it's like, yeah, they are having sex, but like they're not necessarily sex crazed. Like they, like these guys are the ones that like. I mean, they're sex crazed. Like the character, I can't remember his name now, but he's like literally about to masturbate on the couch. Like, his friends are in the next room. I'm like, nah, dude. Like, I would never. And then even like someone I love, like Ryan Hansen, V-Mars Forever, like is just a kind of like unlikable douchebag in this movie. But meant to be.
Yeah. But he's an unlikable douchebag with a heart of gold and everything he's in, though. Like that's his bread and butter. I mean,
right? You just take out the heart of gold in this, and like now he's just a douchebag who really wants to have sex in a boat, I guess. But again, I don't have a problem with that because I don't want to fall in love with every character because like when that happens, like we then run into the struggles I get with Scream where I'm like, well, you can't kill my main three because I love them all. And you already killed Randy. So I hate you. I mean, I love you obviously, but like when you create those likable characters, you're like, you instantly start not rooting for the killer. And suddenly that kill count goes down, which isn't always a bad thing. But in a Friday the 13th movie, like I don't need that kill count to go down. I want to see some set piece kills.
So since Jerry's not here tonight, I will rebut that with something that he brings up very often when we talk about the Friday the 13th movies. His favorite movie of all time, aside from Halloween, is The Final Chapter. And he's really fond of saying that if you took Jason out of The Final Chapter, you're left with one of the best coming-of-age teen comedies of the 1980s, because the characters are just really, for a slasher movie, like extremely well developed overall. And then when you look at the first two Friday the 13th movies, like these are people that I would love to hang out with. Like I get what you're saying about you don't want every single person to die, because that's kind of a bummer. So you do what they do in part two, and half of them go to a bar and are never like seen or heard from for the last 40 minutes of the movie. But I like all those characters. I'm rooting for them. I'm not necessarily rooting for the killer at that point. It's not just that they're not necessarily like super unlikable, because really Trent is the only one who's like really unlikable. He takes the character that had the house in part 7 and he ramps up the douchebaggery to like 20. He's just he fucking sucks. But it's like not just that they're unlikable, but I don't see this group of people ever getting together as friends. Like aside from Chewie and Lawrence, like these aren't people that would like to hang out with one another.
But I think for their age group, that's also kind of part of the, I guess, character development, because they're not high schoolers. They're in university. They're in college, right? I hung out with a lot of pains in the ass in university. Like, I knew a lot of douchebags, and their parents had like a good cottage, and we'd hang out and whatever. Or like people that I was really good friends with who were actually super toxic, and like you didn't really recognize it, right? Like, I buy that these people would be friends, and I buy that Trent the Tool, that's going to be his name for me from now on. I buy that he would keep people like this around him to make himself feel more interesting and to make himself feel better. But I think the idea that we only ever get characters we hate in movies like this because we want to watch them die is a bit of a myth. Like, we get a lot of douchebags because you need to, because nobody's perfect, and you have to have that peppering of like, okay, you can go, and I'd be fine with that. But for the most part of what makes the tension so strong in films like this is that we don't want to see the people die. In fact, in some, I'm trying to remember which Halloween it was or which Friday the 13th, because I can't. At a certain point, they start to bleed together. But like, eventually you just start not giving a shit if they get killed, which kind of negates the actual scare factor. When you care about them, even just a little bit, either you hate them powerfully, like Trent the Tool, or you really like them, like Padalecki, or even Jenna in this. When they die, it's shocking, and it amps up the impact. Like, Jenna's death in this, you expect her to be the final girl. You expect her to make it. When she eats it, it's like, what? Like, when I was watching that for the first time, that genuinely stunned me. I'm like, oh fuck, they went there. Yeah, they took away our lead.
It's a genuinely shocking moment, but is there anything about that character that really stands out at all? She's nice. I mean, she's definitely kinder than everybody else, but that's about it.
Well, and that's, I think, the biggest problem that I have with these groups of kids is not necessarily that I don't like them. It's just that there's not very much there. Like, I feel like Trent has a personality. I hate it, but it's there. And then I feel like some of the other kids, they've got their shtick, you know. And then Jenna's the girlfriend. And then the two blonde girls, they had to give one a camera so that we could tell them apart. You know, I feel like, and I think that's the flaw in the writing that I really do not like, is that I just don't feel like there was anything there with them. And I feel like they truly were there to show their boobs and to be just another pad to the numbers of the body count.
Yeah. And, you know, so Ariel, you said something that's definitely true. I think when I was saying like these movies, I don't mean slashers as much as I mean like genuinely Friday the 13th movies. Like when you look at like slasher kills, like our big numbers, like Jason is easily, I think, like near the top, because you start looking at like Halloween, Ghostface, or like, you know, Michael, Ghostface, Freddy, their numbers are actually usually significantly less, like as far as kill count goes, than Friday. And so, but I what you're saying is definitely true. Like, it is more impactful when we either hate or love them. And it made me think, like, I do think there comes a point in these movies where you start expecting less character development and set piece. It's like you go back to Friday or Nightmare 3. Like, Nightmare 3 is the last one for me that I can really remember like distinct characters, like more than one. Like, there's usually one or two characters, but that whole cast, you know, there's a reason why that whole cast is always the one at every convention. But that movie also became so like, that movie was the one that really set Freddy off in his really big, like, magnificent kills. So it became less about the people and more about the set piece kills. Like, people were expecting that. It's like, we don't care about these characters. How is Freddy going to kill them? And I think Friday did fall, for a while, it fell in line with that a lot, because like we do start to see these more extravagant and ridiculous kills in the series as it goes on.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you there. I think it's just more wishful thinking that we would like everybody.
but you are totally like I was thinking about it when you said it. I was like, oh, she is right, because like the Scream movies, I do care about a lot of people. That's why it hurts so bad when Randy dies. And
oh God, yeah.
And almost everyone in Black Christmas is actually very likable, which makes those kills seem a little more brutal. And I do think sometimes, maybe not necessarily, like, I'm not going to say that, Marcus Nispel had like the forethought of this. Sometimes it's almost too much. I'm like, damn, dude, I can't keep investing in these characters because they keep dying. So I feel like sometimes they like don't want to kill everyone that we fall in love with. But you totally like kind of blew my mind and changed my perspective there. So thanks.
Pleasure.
So we just talked about the kills a little bit from like different movies overall. What are because and I think when you look at a Friday the 13th movie, what you're looking at is less about character and more about how are these characters going to get killed. And this movie has some really standout kill sequences overall and some great deaths overall. And I was rewatching this movie today and just taking some notes before the show. And what stood out to me is like how mean and how mean-spirited some of these kills are, much more so than anything in the original series. Like that scene where Amanda is like getting burned to death in a body bag and her boyfriend is like trapped in a bear trap with his legs shattered, watching his girlfriend burn to death. That is just like, that sticks with you. That's fucked up right there.
Yeah. That's one of my most disturbing deaths in all of horror.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's fascinating to me how they took what's probably one of the more iconic deaths from the franchise with the sleeping bag, and especially when we saw it revisited in Jason X, and he's just pummeling them against the tree, and it's hilarious. And they took it and they made it brutal, and I think that was kind of a stroke of genius because, like, but that one's probably, I'd say that one's probably the most brutal death in the entire film.
Yeah, that and Chewie's death. That one made me really sad.
Which one?
Chewie, because it's so slow and you see his face. Yeah.
That's actually one of the notes I made here is like they linger on Chewie's death a good 15 to 20 seconds, where when you look at Crispin Glover's death in part 4, it's a really iconic death. He gets the corkscrew through the hand and then stabbed, but then it's over. Like it's over in less than a few seconds. This like really lingers on it, and it just it doesn't give you the warm and fuzzies. Like there's nothing to cheer for there.
But that's because we like Chewie, and Crispin Glover danced, so that fucker deserved it.
What? Dude, Crispin Glover. Yeah. So good in that movie. So good. How can people not like Crispin Glover? This is shocking right now. This is like I need to go lie down for a little bit.
I mean, he has a couple of choice short films that I won't bring up that kind of put him in my bad books, but that he's an interesting fella.
His music is nightmare fuel. Is
it ever?
Oh, it's so scary. Yeah, I don't know what's going on. I do think, though, the kills are indicative of the times. This was like an era where like torture porn was huge. So like these are slasher movies. They understand that they're slasher movies, and they understand that they're not Scream and they're not I Know What You Did Last Summer. As much as I love those movies weren't focused on like brutal kills. They were focused on like meta commentary and on like quippy teenagers. So like they have to do something that they think, at least from a production standpoint, is going to do well with kids. And I think they proved that they got it because the movies did so well. But this is that era when that kind of really brutal, savage killing was popular. And so like it's not necessarily torture porn, but it is, it is brutal for in a slasher lens.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons it is because they see it coming. Just about all of the deaths don't come from behind. They're looking at Jason as he's about to kill him, or they're like, with the axe kill is one of the most disturbing ones for me. I keep saying they're all the most disturbing, but yeah, they know what's happening and they can't do anything about it. And I feel like a lot of, especially if you look at the first one, the kills come out of nowhere, or we don't see it happen. And I think seeing the pain and the fear on these people's faces, I think, is what makes it a lot more devastating lots of times.
Yeah, definitely. And it's actually interesting the way you put that, and even bringing up like the way you said that, at this point we were getting like, it was a lot of gore porn, and this kind of reflects that. But at the same time, versus like, there's a reason why Nightmare and Scream were so different from something like Halloween, or even specifically Friday and Jason is that, we had Wes Craven and they were more psychological, and he was taking them to a different place. So it wasn't about, like you said, the brutality of the kills so much as it was about the how and the why and the torture of it and the psychological torture. And here, I mean, I wouldn't go as far as to call these, and I know you're not calling them torture porn, but you can definitely see the influence of the brutality. I forgot about the axe for a second though, so thanks for that. It's so brutal though.
It is, man. And it's so simple. I think that's like the equivalent of the sleeping bag to the tree, because I didn't think that would kill somebody, but there it is, and I just watched it. And now I'm scared forever.
I do think too, it's interesting to think back, looking at the time these are made. Like, this was made mid to late 2008 before it's released. So we're in a time period where we're in the middle of two wars, completely pointless wars that we don't see any end of getting out of anytime soon. We're seeing enemies behind every corner. And you also, like, these are coming out at the height of, or at the start of, like, a really shitty recession where people are losing their homes. Everyone's saving has dried up. Like, it was a very negative, dark time in our country overall. And I think a lot of the movies of this era kind of reflect the kind of grim reality of what was going on at the time. And there's just like no hope in a lot of these movies. So like when you look back at this mid 2000 to the really around 2009, you see a lot of horror movies with the complete absence of any hope whatsoever. So I think from a sociological standpoint, that's always interesting.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what movies are going to be coming out in the next couple of years based on what's going on right now.
I'm stunned that like art has not taken a hard turn to the left, that we're not seeing things quite yet. I mean, I'm a little bit older. Didn't grow up necessarily around the time of 80s punk, but I got into it not too long after that would have fallen out. And when you look back at the early 80s and the days of Reagan, and you look at the music and the films that were coming out in that time period, how they were really reflected like a rebellion against that. I'm stunned we're not seeing more of that right now in 2019.
Yeah. I think people are still trying to make sense of a lot of it too.
I think a lot of it is there's fewer media companies and they don't want to piss one side off. I mean, look what's going on. You see a movie like The Hunt where it's like, oh, we're trying to bring both sides together, like horse shit. Like, that's completely kind of bullshit right now. I think you find that companies don't want to piss off potential customers. That's what they're concerned with.
It's also interesting when you think about the way film reflects, historically speaking, the way film has reflected the times. Like, yeah, you bring up the Reagan era and things like that, but if you think back to even to like World War II and the golden age of Hollywood, when the majority of what we were getting was escapism, right? So we are getting some kind of pitter-patters of kind of sociological commentary, and we're getting the Ari Asters, we're getting the Jordan Peels, and we're getting that kind of content, but it's not in droves. I think for the most part, people are reluctant to really engage with stuff that is, unless it's outstanding and it really hits all like on every cylinder at the fucking nines. They want stuff that's easy to digest. They want stuff that's going to scare you in the theater and not stay with you when you get home, because life is scary enough. And I think once it is out of office, shall we say, we may see a change. I think we're going to see that onslaught of political horror once things change.
I think so too. I think it's going to be like floodgates opening.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And it's so telling because it's like you said, we are looking for that escapism. Like, what are the biggest horror movies in the world right now? Conjuring, because that's not anything that's close to what, like, that is, supernatural. That is something that is very different. There's not a lot of political overtone to anything in the Wandaverse, as much as, and I love all of those movies, but it is like that, very much that thing where we're scared as shit in the theater, but we don't carry that home with us because, like, I don't come home and I'm not afraid of Bathsheba on the top of my dresser. Like, it's a great scene, it sticks with me, but like, I mean, it's not an actual fear that's happening. It is interesting though, like, because I am seeing, again, like, slashers are my favorite genre. We're seeing a trend up in slasher films, which tends to happen with political turmoil. Like, originally when the Halloween movies were coming out, there was a huge, like, women's uprising, which, I mean, the slasher movies, again, that's why I've always argued that most of the time they are more feminist than and anti-feminist, like we are seeing that return. Like I think Halloween 2018 is a huge point, like signal towards that. And then, Tree and the Happy Death Day movies, like I do think I've seen a lot of slasher movies like on the docket, and I think we are slowly, like I do think we're going to get like a slasher renaissance, and then we're going to get that full, like Jen, like you said, like the floodgates.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're getting a lot of horror movies now that look inward. Ariel, you brought up Ari Aster. I think his movies, they could exist at any point in time. Like he could have, if he could have made similar movies to Hereditary and Midsommar 10 years ago or 20 years ago, because I think that they are very inward looking and a way to cope with trauma and a way to cope with things that have gone on in your life that are just terrible. Like I look at Hereditary, I think it's an incredible look at schizophrenia and inherited mental illness. It's something I've struggling to write about for a book that I've been trying to pitch, but it's one of the best. I've worked with a number of schizophrenics in counseling, and that's what it's like. I mean, it's interesting and fascinating and scary to work with him. There is an article I'm going to link to in our show notes that was published today, because we had talked about maybe that like movies like The Conjuring are a bit of escapism. Happy Death Day is really fun escapism, and rather than create art that reflects the horror show we're in, we're getting things that are kind of giving us a 90-minute or 2-hour reprieve from it. It's an article in the New Republic called Trump's Tax on the National Psyche, and it talks about the incredible amount of fear and energy that is kind of just wasted on this revolving horror show that we have going on every day. Like every day it's a new corruption, it's a new evil. Like the cruelty is the whole point of this, of what we're living through right now. So I think that you're raising a really good point, saying maybe we just need 2 hours to kind of forget about that every now and again.
And it's interesting because I hear from one of the most common things I hear from people who don't like horror and people who find out about what I do, their reaction is, well, why would you want to put yourself through that all the time? And like the main reason they don't watch horror is because they don't like feeling scared. And I think it's interesting when you talk about this article that you just brought up. And I think that's the thing, is so many of us have a reason to be afraid right now, no matter who we are or what our background is. Some more than others, arguably, yes. But for the most part, everyone, unless you're like a cis het white person who is super wealthy, you're afraid. And if you're not afraid every day, you're afraid at least a couple days a week, and it's exhausting. So yeah, I mean, people like Ari Aster, they're giving us that psychological take on horror, and that's almost a relief. Like depending on how you approach it, it's kind of that therapeutic kind of release of the fears you're feeling. It kind of allows you to channel it, but for the most part, we're trying to get the fuck away from it.
Yeah, I agree. Like Ari Aster, especially, I think is extremely. Those movies are taxing, but they're cathartic in a way, because the way he expresses like how we deal with grief is so important. I just like truly feel like it's. A lot of people awkwardly laugh at that scene in Midsommar where they're like they're screaming, breathing all together. But I actually found that scene so like important and like interesting, because we need that in today's society. Like we need that message of like it's okay to grieve, and two, it's okay to grieve how you're going to, and three, we need to do it together. And so I think there is a lot of that messaging that is being taken away in those movies that is indicative of our times. And so something like, comparing Friday to the movies now, like I still don't even think Friday would do as well now, because it's so bleak. And whereas like a lot of people look at Midsommar and Hereditary, and yes, they are bleak as hell, but they are also very intrinsic and I think thought-provoking when it comes to how we deal with anxiety, with how we deal with grief, with how we deal with loss and depression, which is a huge issue right now. So I think they're really important movies.
Oh, hands down, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I cannot disagree with any of that. Absolutely. So I have a couple more things I just wanted to touch on, if you guys have the time to. Is that all right?
Yeah.
We're looking good. All right. So, Jed, you had sent over your notes earlier, and I had done some up as well. And I think, we had kind of similar ideas on like the sexual politics of this movie, because it's like one of the most sexually aggressive movies.
Yeah.
As much as like we think of like slasher movies as a lot of TNA, this one is like really throwing it in your face, almost like it's challenging the eyes. Like, this is what you came for, right, guys?
Right. And I feel like there's a way to do that. Like, I look at a movie like Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon, which I love. And I think there's a moment where you just get the camera right at some boobs, and they're showing you, but they're saying, this is what you want, we're giving it to you, and also kind of alluding, but they're not making it part of the story. It's very clear what they're doing. And I think in this movie, I think I wrote in my notes, like, there are so many boobs in this movie, and we don't need most of them. And I'm not against nudity. I just want there to be a reason other than to tell me something about the character that you can't do in the writing. But it bugged me, because I feel like they are trying to lean into this. They're saying, yeah, this is what you're coming for, right? We know you want boobs in slashers. And so they just leaned all the way in, and they did it while still objectifying the women, which is something that bugs me, because I think Leslie Vernon is able to do that without like a super heavy male gaze. I feel like they're drawing attention to it. Or if you look like at a movie like Jennifer's Body, there's no nudity in that movie, but it's very sexual, and it's a different type of objectification. And there's no reason for her to be water skiing topless other than to tell us that she's a loose woman. And it bugged me. And there were so many, sorry, I'm getting on my little soapbox about this.
No. Don't apologize for that.
The soapbox is yours.
I hated how many times a character talked about a woman where it was either right behind their back or to like a photo spread of them in an article talked about them as an object, either without them seeing it or with the first group of kids, the ones that have sex in the tent, like they're doing this over someone's shoulder, and it's just so in your face. And the women are enjoying this objectification in a way that I found really upsetting too. And somebody wrote, I saw in the notes, it was very sex negative. It looked at sex as something that makes you a whore. And if you look at all of the characters in them, all of the female characters, there are two final girls, and everybody else is topless, and the only one that dies is the only one that I feel like is shocking when she dies is Jenna. And it's because she hasn't taken her top off. And so I was shocked that they killed her. I just feel like the movie set all of this up in a way that really rubbed our noses in it, but still managed to objectify as well.
It's interesting to me because I agree with you wholeheartedly. And you will never hear me argue against a film's objectification of women. Like, if it's obvious and it's there, yes, 100%. And here, absolutely, 100%. And you're dead on. And I think it's an interesting way to analyze why Jenna's death is so shocking, but I totally think you're right. But I will say this. All of the women who have sex in this film, their sexual pleasure is of importance because they talk about finishing. They talk about climaxing and like, no, don't you finish yet? I haven't yet. And there is an aspect of it. It's a microcosm, but there is an element there. And I wouldn't go as far as to call it sex positive, but I would go as far as to say that it, to an extent, embraces the fact that it is okay for women to just want sex, and maybe, I don't want to say want to be objectified because that's really dangerous language, but I mean, yes, we want to be treated respectfully in a sexual context as women. Like, that's a thing that we want. Sometimes we also just kind of want to be treated sexually, and that's okay. And I don't think that it's necessarily done in the right way here. I think you are right that it's kind of, that term, like saying that it's sex negative is still pretty apt because, you're right. They're using nudity as a character, as a plot device, as opposed to it's not functional. But there are aspects to it that I think can be shed in a positive light.
I completely agree with you. And there is no everything is consensual too, which I'll give the movie that. No, you're right.
Yeah, I think I'm a male. I don't want to speak out of turn here. I agree with both of you. I feel like they tried. Like, I feel like they're like, no, we're sex positive, right? Like, you know, it's a bunch of guys sitting around. They're like, this is good, right? And they're like, yeah, this is good. And then like they fail to ask a female, like, hey, is this good? Because she would have been the one who's like, maybe let's take out the one who's water skiing topless. And also the line about him being a button on her pants, like that doesn't need to exist.
Right.
Because there are, I do agree with both of you. Like I do think there's a lot of objectification in this movie, and it seems unnecessary. Which I feel like, who knows? Like maybe they're like, yeah, it's, you know, we're leaning in those 80s tropes. But I do think like there are things like Ariel brought up, like she's like, don't finish without me, and like she chooses to record them, which I think was an interesting thing to do, because like, yeah, it almost seems unnecessary, but also at the same time, like she enjoys her own body. Like, I mean, she like, because she's also recording herself. She is not recording him. So like, she thinks her body is sexy. Or, like, that's one way you could view it. Who knows what their lens was on that? But like, like it could be that she just has like, she's really into her own sexual agency. So I agree with you. Like, it's almost like they could have done something with it, but they like again, I feel like they failed to like actually ask a single female what their thoughts on it were.
Yeah, I wish more
scripts.
Mm-hmm. I wish more movies would subscribe to the Guillermo del Toro way of approaching things, a la Crimson Peak, which is like the most feminist film with such body positivity, and like the sex scene is all about her pleasure and she's never naked in it, and it's like, cool guys, let's do more of this, please, because this is great. Like, have a slasher film where instead of a chick getting, you know, like having sex from behind, I will put things as politically correctly as I can, you know, go down on her, man. Like, make it about her instead of about you. Why not? Yeah. Be more sex positive.
I think, Ryan, you hit it right on the head where you said it's a guy's idea of what a sex positive movie would look like.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's a really apt analogy right there. Gold star.
Halfway there. Didn't finish to completion.
So my own personal take on like sex and nudity in slasher movies, like I get why it was a big part of early slasher movies and the VHS era, because when you look at like who is by and large renting these movies in that time, it's a lot of like young teenage boys. And they are interested in sex, they're interested in the female body, and this is where they got to see it. I mean, that's why like I'm old enough to remember the days of like having a scrambled cable box and like basically being like, I think I saw a nipple. I think I saw this is the fucking greatest thing ever. You know, like it's just like staticky boobs. You don't need that anymore. Like you can turn anywhere at this point and find like something sexy. You don't necessarily need to have that as like an integral part of your slasher movies or movies at all. I remember the first year I hosted at Telluride Horror Show, I did a Q&A with like the directors of this really shitty like nouveau slasher movie. And they talked about how the actress they signed for their lead wasn't going to do a nude, and how they like coerced her into doing it and like basically browbeat her. And it's like, I think I just ended the Q&A. I'm like, right, well, no more questions. I'm like, this is really shitty. Like, I really like, this is not cool. Like, we don't need that nowadays. So that I think was the first time that it really struck me like, what the fuck are we doing here? So.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think in this time, like the movies we're seeing now, I think there's a lot more of a realization that women are fans of these kinds of movies too. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to see boobs. That was one of the things that bugged me a little bit about Freddy versus Jason, is I think it just assumed that the fans were like teenage boys or like guys in college. And I wanted to see that movie too. And I just don't think there was an understanding that I didn't feel included in the intended audience for that movie. And I think we're starting to see a huge shift in that.
Well, even like you mentioned, you know, like I'm going there and I'm not a teenage boy and I don't want to see boobs. Like I'm queer and I'm not going there watching it being like, yes, tits. Mm-hmm. Like that's not a thing that I'm like, this isn't something that I need. Like, it's, I mean, it's fine. They're great. Yes, her nipple placement is exquisite, whatever. But like, cool. Give me something else. Like,
yeah. Well, like in Midsommar, like there's male nudity in there, and like I could have taken it or left it. Taken it or left it. Like I wasn't there for that swinging penis, you know.
Well, yeah, you don't sit there and like look at that and immediately go, yes, eroticism, let's go. That scene is awkward as hell for a reason. And like, it's nudity for the sake of illustrating that point, but we never see that with women.
And I feel like if it's not part of the story and you see that nudity and you say, hooray, let's go, I feel like there's a lack in your storytelling anyways, because that's how your audience is not with the story enough.
Exactly. Yeah, completely.
Agreed. So what else do we have? I think overall, like, is there anything I'm missing within the text of the movie itself that you guys wanted to cover that we haven't talked about?
I thought it was an interesting thing they did with the final girl. Because I really thought that both Jenna and Whitney were going to survive at the end. And I think maybe it's just because I've grown up watching Scream so many times. And it's almost like I think of it not as a final girl lots of times anymore, as more like a quartet. And so I was thinking, which is a Stephen King thing. But it's like they almost flip-flopped the final girl for the sake of the storytelling. And I thought it was really interesting. And I think it served the purpose of the story, especially since they did so many, I don't want to say retcons, but so much like catching us up at the beginning of the movie that they kind of seamlessly wove those two characters back and forth, kind of fulfilling the same function.
I found that to be particularly interesting too, and pretty much for the same reason. And also, I mean, when you think about the structure of a story, Jenna was kind of our gateway into this current world, like the second group. She was our gateway point. She was our access point. That's usually the final girl. Like we're trained to feel like that's the person who's going to make it out. So when you take her away, it shifts the narrative to secondary characters, which is really strange from a writing standpoint. Like that's really unusual. And they pull it off. And again, that just comes back to like strong writing.
What do we think of our final boy, Jared Padalecki, as Clay?
I would love to have a little more personality. But I say that as someone who did not watch Gilmore Girls or Supernatural.
Well, his character in Gilmore Girls is the most vanilla character in the entire world. So
it's basic. When you see Jared Padalecki, this is what you get.
Yeah, I mean, he plays Jared Padalecki, and I like him in Supernatural, but like this is like a dumbed down version of his character in Supernatural. Oh. I think he's boring. He's a vessel to tell a story. That's pretty much it. And he was popular again. CW cast. He's attractive to look at. So like sure. If I have to look at a boring man the whole time, I'd rather it be Jared Padalecki than Travis Van Winkle. So I mean, there's that, but I do like, that's my only gripe with this. I love this movie. One of my only gripes with it is it doesn't give us, I think our best final girls or boys always have really great character arcs. And like they, in such a small amount of time, like they have like an arc still. I think that's why Sydney is amazing, and Nancy. I call her by her real name like we're buds. Hey, Heather. And then Ginny in Friday the 13th Part 2, I think, is one of the most complete characters in the Friday series. So like that's actually one of my only gripes is I don't love the end of this movie because of I don't love the final boy / girls, and I also don't love the end because I think it is a really bad like callback to a trope that doesn't really even super exist in horror movies. I don't know why horror movies were always like it's always like there's that stinger, and I'm like that actually doesn't happen that much. Like in horror films, like there isn't a whole lot of stuff that's usually like like super like winking at the audience, like, and we'll be back. You run into the occasional movie that had the end question mark. But I mean, Friday Part 1 was one of the first ones and one of the only ones that really did it. And I don't think it's earned here. So I don't love that.
Well, Fridays 1, 2, and 5 for sure all have stingers at the end of them.
One has one too.
What's that?
I was going to say Elm Street 1 has one too.
Elm Street is the franchise that jumps out always has a stinger. I've come to, in a modern movie like Sinister 2 has a stinger at the end. I've kind of come to the agreement with myself that the last minute of any horror movie with a stinger like that last minute doesn't exist. I think that's like just like, nope, they've gotten away, like we're good to go, time to go, like it just doesn't exist. It's a figment of the collective audience imagination at that point. It's interesting about Jared Padalecki, like I put in my notes, he looks like the dude who always like doesn't get what he wants for Christmas. He always looks like that, and he's like trying not to pout in front of people. And it's interesting that a month before this, My Bloody Valentine 3D comes out with Jensen Ackles, and I think like a lot of fans love that movie.
Yeah, love that movie.
Like that dude has charisma to spare, and I think it was an interesting thing where both of these guys are in a fairly popular show, Supernatural, and maybe we're looking for some sort of exit strategy, and yet here we are 10 years later, and that show is still on.
They've been to hell like 5 times and back, I think.
It's the final season, though. They are ending.
My wife was really upset when she found out it was the final season. Oh. She loves that show. So, but he just like doesn't do it. He like you said, he's just kind of like a decoration. Like he's very handsome, fun to look at, definitely fun to look at. He's looking absolutely ripped in this movie too. Like definitely can fill out a t-shirt, but not much else going on there for him.
Well, and if you look at like Jenna and Whitney are not super interesting either. No. So you've got your 3 final quartet people, and I like had a hard time remembering their names, you know. And if you compare that to someone like Laurie and Sydney, where you're really rooting for them 1,000%, I think that's kind of one of the things in this film that's lacking.
I'm imagining a Three's Company reboot with like Clay, Jenna, and Whitney, and it would be the shittiest sitcom of all time. Like so.
And then Jason is Mr. Roper, right?
Well, you would have Robert Englund as Mr. Furley at that point.
Yeah, I do think it's again kind of like these remakes became very popular, and like what happened instead of like they were so focused on kind of like that really slick look, and then also these like kind of like spectacular kills, that character arc didn't become super important. Like as much as I love a lot of these remakes, there's not a whole lot of like character development within most of them. My best friend and I literally call it the CW slashers because they were all actors from like CW shows. It was like every single person that was showing up who was an attractive young 20-something was popping up in these. And so I do think like that was just kind of that common trend of the era was, I mean, because like you just said, I mean, My Bloody Valentine had Jensen Ackles, had Kerr Smith, who was from Dawson's Creek. It had Jamie King. Sorority Row would go on to have, Rumor Willis was in it. Like all of these, Prom Night has Brittany Snow. Like all of these just had these like CW actors. So it's just
Michelle,
like a popular trend.
Black Christmas was Michelle Trachtenberg from Buffy.
Yep, and Mary Elizabeth Winstead. Yeah, so it was just
the Real World on that.
She was in Sorority Row.
Ah, that's right. Jamie, I think.
Yeah,
they're all just very glossy and shiny and pretty, and lots of times devoid of personality.
Right. Would agree. So overall, this movie, how does it do? I mean, it comes out of the gate like gangbusters. It makes about $40 million over its first weekend. It actually makes more in the first weekend than any of the original Friday the 13th movies did in their original run. Now, obviously, that's not adjusted for inflation overall, but after that first week, it sinks like a stone. About 80% drop off from one week to the next. So it gets people go and see it right away, but then the word of mouth is like, you can skip this one, which is interesting to me.
Well, and I think it came out on Friday the 13th, too. So I remember I wanted to go see it on that day because it was Friday the 13th. And I think if you're not super into that movie and you missed it that Friday, you're not going to be super into it the next weekend.
I just wonder if it's an issue of, did people not go after the first weekend because they heard it wasn't any good? Or was that the ceiling for this franchise? Like, basically, I think to your point, Jen, everyone that wanted to see it saw it, and maybe these characters aren't as beloved as we like to think outside of our own little community.
Yeah, it's the sad truth. Yeah, I think it's probably a mix of both of those things.
Well, and like you said, we were going through a recession. People weren't going to the movies multiple times. It was also, I'd say, the heyday of like the Rotten Tomatoes score, where a Rotten Tomatoes score could, like, you lived and died by it. Like, I definitely remember my friends trying to talk me out of going to see movies because of Rotten Tomatoes scores around that time. And I was like, every horror movie gets bad Rotten Tomatoes scores. I'm not going to stop horror movies in theaters. Because you look at like what came out around it, nothing did. Like, there was nothing it was competing against. Fired Up came out, the cheerleading comedy came out a week later. So, and Medea Goes to Jail took its spot at top of the box office. So I do think it's also, like you said, everyone saw it, but also we were in a recession. So no one who loved it was going to go see it again.
Right. And I think between this,
sorry,
you first.
I was going to say, I get frustrated sometimes when people complain about not going to see movies in the theaters. Like, I have 2 young kids. Movies, like, we just bought our It tickets and they were like $38. Like, I've got to really pick and choose which movies I'm going to see in the theaters. I'm dying to see Booksmart, but if it comes down to me seeing Booksmart or like Godzilla, a movie that's really going to benefit from me seeing it on a big screen, I'm going to pick that, although I didn't actually see it in the theater because we couldn't get a babysitter. But like, I think that metric to measure success and like value of movies, I think it's hard to keep that going with how much it costs to go to the movies now.
I to your point, Jen, like a date night to the movies for my wife and I, by the time you add everything up, is over $100.
Right.
That's scary.
Yeah.
It adds up. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It really does.
Kids.
Yeah, we'll keep them, but yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. My 9-year-old wants to go see It Chapter 2 in the theaters, and I'm debating, like, do we wait till it comes out in video, or do I want to be that parent that's like, hi, shitty parent, taking my kid to like a 3-hour horror movie?
when I saw Chapter 1 in theaters, there was a little girl sitting 2 rows in front of me with her dad, and as soon as we got in, I was like, oh man, that's really, like, that's rude. That father's like irresponsible. Meh. And then the movie started and it's going, and I'm a very engaged, interactive viewer. I react, man, and I am not ashamed of it. This kid was just steely-eyed, like, what? Fuck you. Like, watching the movie, like, not even flinching, and I'm like, all right, I stand corrected. By all means, go ahead.
The best experience I've had with a little kid in an inappropriate movie, there was a 5-year-old girl at a 10 p.m. on a Tuesday night screening of Cabin in the Woods who was very vocal about telling her parents and everybody else in the theater that she did not want to be there. And I'm like, well,
that's such a good movie, but I get you. 5-year-old.
But she's 5.
So sad.
So it was. But yeah, all right. I don't know how we got on that topic, but nope, we tend to devolve. So this is the last Friday the 13th movie in theaters. Like, other ideas have been floated around. When found footage movies were the new hit thing. I mean, basically 6 months after this movie, Paranormal Activity comes out. And it's like a bomb goes off in terms of like what happens to horror over the next few years. So now there's an idea like, let's do Friday the 13th as a found footage movie, which is the worst fucking idea I think I've heard.
Yes.
There's an idea for like setting it in like in the wintertime and having snow, which sounds pretty awesome. Now we have a lawsuit, and who knows when we're going to get a new Friday the 13th movie.
It's heartbreaking. Yeah. It's honestly one of my biggest, like, I get really sad when I think about it, that because we got a new Halloween, like last year, and it's been a long time since A Nightmare 2, but like we know that at least is on the docket somewhere because it's not tied up in litigation. But it's crazy to think that this massive franchise that has existed since the 80s and has had 12 entries, we're not having anything because of this like litigation. And again, to look at the box office on this thing, and to like, because you look at it and you're like, I hear a lot of people say now, they're like, well, why isn't there a new one? They don't know. They're like, did it not do well? I'm like, no, it did great. Like, it made almost $100 million on a $20 million budget. Even like taking in like promos and stuff, that's still like $50-60 million profit. So like, it did very well. It's just such a bummer that we don't have anything.
It did well. I do know that, like, I think it was Brad Fuller was on the record as saying that because of how much that it dropped, and because of the same thing happened to A Nightmare on Elm Street a year later, that they did get gun shy about doing anything else with it. And that's part of why we didn't see something right away, is because they worried that like everybody that turned out that first weekend might stay home the second time around, which silly because like, again, this movie's a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to go if there's a new one.
Oh yeah. And I hope they can get Derek Mears back if so, because he was perfect.
Yep.
Yeah. And if you guys get a chance, I encourage anyone out there who's listening to, you can find Nick Antosca's script online for the Friday the 13th movie that he wrote. Nick Antosca he's the guy behind Channel Zero. He did like a 13 episode run on Hannibal. He's doing that new movie Antlers. It's spectacular. So it's a bummer to that. We have things like the Friday the 13th game, which they also put a halt to, and we have scripts from people like Nick Antosca, and we're just sitting here with like our hands in our pockets waiting.
Well, what you're seeing now are like the rise of like these fan films. I would say anybody that hasn't seen Never Hike Alone, go on to, it's free to watch on YouTube. It's phenomenal. Like if it was an official entry into the series, it would sit kind of near the top for me in terms of like quality of film. And I know that Womp Stomp Films and Vincente they're going to be announcing a follow-up to it and have some real clear plans for it. I believe September 13th is when they're going to kind of press forward with like what the next phase is for them. So if you haven't seen Never Hike Alone, it's really well done and a lot of fun to watch.
Mm-hmm.
So any last words on Friday the 13th, 2009, my friends?
Go see it if you haven't, man. Get some friends together, have a party, and just enjoy. Yeah. It is fun.
It is a fun movie to watch with the crowd. Absolutely.
And
so, yeah, it is a lot of fun. So before we sign off, everybody, I know that you guys all have different projects that you're working on. So why don't we go around a little bit? And, I know, Ryan, you are relaunching Ghastly Grinning or kind of changing things up a little bit. Like, what's going on with that?
So Ghastly Grinning was the website I launched about a year ago that our whole focus is looking at the genre that we all love. Through a celebratory and positive lens. I got so tired of reductive and like such like harshly critical things online. The world is toxic enough as is. So I was like, no, we need to celebrate and really bring some positivity to this genre that we're all in love with. So everything on the site is from a positive angle. And it's also, we push for LGBTQIA and female and minority representation in the genre as well. So like that's our main goal. Unfortunately, like, I'm really excited because all of my writers have gone on to do bigger and better things. They're all working for places like Arrow and Film Nation or Film Rejects, but I can't do everything alone. So I had to reduce the site, and instead we're still doing reviews and some editorials here and there, but I'm launching the Ghastly Grinning podcast, which I'm calling like the late night show of horror. My goal with that is to really, yes, I have some fun guests lined up for that, like directors and screenwriters, but most importantly, I want to focus on people in the journalism field. So the people that are like my kind of personal heroes. So I have a lot of people like Anya Stanley that you're going to see her byline everywhere. I have a huge list somewhere, but like that's going to be our goal, and that launches the next couple of weeks. I also have my Keep Screaming podcast, which again, that's my best friend and I. Every 2 weeks, we dissect a horror movie, a different slasher movie. And then coming up, it will be officially announced soon, but I am launching the Horror Heals fundraiser, which is actually going to be hand in hand with Stop the Stigma, which is a charity. And what we're doing is we're reaching out to people in the industry who are going to donate props, memorabilia, autographs, different things from projects that they've worked on. And we're going to sell all of that, and we're going to donate 100% of the proceeds to Stop the Stigma, which is a charity that is all about promoting mental health awareness and people who don't have the means or the funds necessarily to get it, how they can find those.
That's really cool.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. And that We were trying to get it officially. Hopefully, the actual fundraiser will happen the week of Halloween. But for it to actually be a fundraiser, you got to go through some government processes, which are kind of taking a little bit of time. And then I'm also working on getting like an official ID number. I'm fortunate enough to work for Starbucks, and Starbucks will actually match the proceeds. So once I get all that in line, so once I get that in line, we'll officially announce that. But it's coming up pretty quick.
Yeah, and if it's anything like. I know in the mental health industry, one of the things we try to do is act as advocates overall and also give back as part of the community. So I know like I've had clients I've done pro bono work for before. So, I mean, I think obviously we have a mental health crisis in this country, and I can tell you that like the backlog for someone trying to get help on average falls between 6 and 8 weeks. For someone that's at the end of their rope, it's really hard because there's just not enough of us out there to kind of help people out. So I think that's a project that if there's any way I can assist in spreading the word, please like lean on me, because that sounds really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And Stop the Stigma is great. They do a lot. Again, like I said, they really make sure to try to reach out. It gives you it gives people who don't have the funds like access to therapy sessions, and whether that's in person or over the phone, it gives just people a lot of those avenues that they wouldn't necessarily think of. And they also do a lot of work with like helping families adjust to mental health, because I know a lot of times like people's families have a hard time adjusting to their family member like being affected by something from mental health. So they do a lot of like that work too.
Excellent. Definitely want to hear more about that. I'm looking forward to hear about the work you guys do with him in the future. Ariel, tell us about The Bite and everything else you have going on.
So I have a column, as I mentioned earlier, at Slash Film. It's called Queering the Scene. So queering is, if anyone's not familiar with the term, queering is an actual academic term that means doing a queer reading of something. So the column is geared towards doing a queer reading of film, whether it's genre or drama or comedy, what have you. The first one was on the Slumber Party Massacre. The second one was on Mission Impossible 2. And the third one should be good to go by the end of this month. It's been a busy few weeks, so I'm a little behind. So that shall be coming soon. And then otherwise, we have The Bite. So Shudder has a weekly newsletter called The Bite, where we have a lead piece every month that's a look into horror history. It's usually around anniversaries. And then the rest of The Bite is all little snippets from horror news and fun things and an image of the week and everything like that. So really interesting stuff. It's good gateway stuff if you're not into horror. It's really excellent if you're already into horror and you kind of want to broaden your horizons, because it straddles the world of, horror fan culture and kind of everything else. But if you haven't subscribed, you can go to try.shudder.com to subscribe, and it comes out every Tuesday. We've got a really interesting lineup coming up for September, so I'm just finalizing all of that stuff, and you will on Monday the 26th, I will be announcing everything first thing in the morning. So that will be that's something to look forward to.
Cool. And you're on your way to cover, is it TIFF kicking off this week?
Yes. Next week, in a week and a half. I've lost track of time, so I have no idea where I am or when that's happening. September 5th, TIFF starts. Okay. And so that goes from the 5th to the 15th. There will be a lot of interesting coverage coming out of there, including Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead's Synchronic. So that's having its world premiere at TIFF, which is exceptionally exciting. And we should be getting Parasite, Bong Joon-ho's new movie. So that's really, really exciting. And then after that is Fantastic Fest, and the fun just never stops, and the sleep never happens.
Benson and Moorhead are my two favorite filmmakers working in genre right now. I really hope we get Synchronic at Telluride Horror Show. Really hope we are able to pull that in, because I absolutely adore everything they've done to date so far.
Oh, yeah, they do amazing work.
Yeah. Jen, what's going on with the Horror Virgin?
So we talked a little bit about it at the beginning, but yeah, we're a comedy horror podcast where we talk about a movie every week. Mikey, Todd, and I sit down and we all watch a movie together, and then we talk about it and how scared Todd was and why I love it so much. If you like How Did This Get Made and you like horror, you'll like our podcast. The most recent episode, the one that's out right now, is Overlord, and depending on when this drops, our Jennifer's Body episode is about to come out too.
I think it'll
Yay!
hit the same day. It will hit the same day. So
Oh yeah.
once you're done listening to this, just into Jennifer's body. How did this idea come? So to me, it's such a good idea, and it's completely unique. Like I don't know of any other podcast that does something like this, where they're like torturing their friend every week for over a year now. So how did this idea come about?
Well, so one of our original members was Clint, and he and Todd had been friends forever. And Clint always tried to get him to go to horror movies, and he never would because he hated them. But when we could convince him that we could make a podcast about it, that's when he signed on. So
Okay.
it's been a long time in the making. But another thing I wanted to talk about is I also write a blog for our website. It's at horrorvirgin.com, and not quite as hilarious as the podcast is. I tend to write a lot about feminism and mental health and sexual assault, and it gets a little deep, but it's been a really helpful way for me to kind of process a lot of the things that have happened in my life. And just, the most recent one was about scary stories to tell in the dark and just how powerful it is to share our stories with each other. And I have one about Jennifer's body and the perfection that I'm working on right now that I'm really excited about. So check that out.
Definitely. And that's over at horrorvirgin.com.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, guys, thank you so much for coming on with us tonight and filling in for Jerry, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight. Love to
before I forget, because he'll kill me, he did tell me to say Jerry thinks Friday the 13th is the bee's knees.
All right, fair enough.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me on. This was so much fun.
We'd love to have all of you on again at some point, so definitely, please do. So we're going to be, I think next week, we're going to be starting our Blair Witch Project coverage, which I'm really excited about. I will tell everybody, if you heard our Friday the 13th Part 2 episode with Al White, director of Starfish, his podcast, We the Geeks, is also covering the Blair Witch Project at the same time as us. I've heard the first episode on A Curse of the Blair Witch. It's fantastic. I'm like, shit. I'm like going through all my notes going like, they've covered this already. God damn it. I don't have a sexy British accent. No one's going to want to listen to this. Half the reason I will say that half the reason I married my wife, she sounds just like Mary Poppins. So it's amazing. It's incredible. If she had a Cockney accent, I probably wouldn't, but that's okay. But no, I'm really excited. I was just on holiday and I spent pretty much every night there in a pub when everyone went to bed, just like writing about the Blair Witch Project. To me, it's one of my top 3 favorite horror movies of all time. It still scares the crap out of me to this day. It's one of the rare movies I won't let my daughter watch because A, I think it'll either A, scare her too much, or B, she won't appreciate it. And I want her to be a little bit older so she can get a real appreciation for how great this movie is. So it's a little bit sad to say goodbye to our Friday the 13th coverage, but I am super excited for what we have coming up. So thanks to everyone for listening, and we'll be back next week.